to give you a question to think about during the talk. And you can think about it if you want to. I like to write about mountains, as you can gather from the introduction. In particular, I like to write about climbing. And this book is about climbing really big mountains. So,
I think the speaker's speaking.
Oh, okay.
It's not going to amplify our voice, but if you want to speak just a little louder, I'll shut this door too.
Oh, okay. So yeah, this book is about climbing mountains in the Himalaya and the Karakoram. So big mountains, traditionally climbed by expeditions who have come from away, so Europe, North America, and other places. And we've read books and we've read reports and all kinds of things about these climbs over the years. But the question for you to think about is, why, when we read these stories and hear about these stories, do we traditionally remember the names of the white people who were on the expeditions instead of the other people who were on the expeditions? The local climbers who were assisting, sometimes equal partners, and sometimes actually leading the expeditions. That's the question. So you can just think about that if you want to. Okay, so I think we're rolling here. Can you hear me, or am I just not speaking loud enough?
Yeah.
Okay. If I try and speak much louder, I'll probably go hoarse. Just saying. Okay, so when I think back to when I first started, seriously considering this book, it was actually while I was doing research for my previous book, which was called Winter 8000. So Winter 8000 is about climbing 8,000 meter peaks, but in winter. It's kind of a niche activity. And so I was interviewing, famous climbers, high altitude climbers. Again, there weren't that many of them who were winter specialists, but there were a few. Simone Moro from Italy is one of them. Krzysztof Wilicki from Poland. The Polish climbers are particularly fond of winter, and Russian Denis Arubko. I mean, it's kind of the same old crew all the time. One of the climbers that I interviewed was this guy, Ali Sadpara from Pakistan. And he was a really important player in this winter game at 8,000 meters. He'd been on Broad Peak and Gasherbrum 1 with Polish teams, and he came really close to climbing Nanga Parbat in winter in 2015. And then in 2016, he succeeded. And it was on this face, the Kinschhofer face, that he and Simone Moro, the Italian, and a Basque climber named Alex Tsicon, they made the first winter ascent of Nanga Parbat. Well, over 34 teams had been trying to do this over a period of 50 years. So you can imagine, it was a major mountaineering accomplishment to do this. However, Ali Sadpara received very little recognition outside of his country. And at first, I didn't think too much about it because, of course, I interviewed him for this book that I was writing. But then I started going to festivals and seeing, public events where the climbers from that team were sort of showcased. And Ali Sadpara was always kind of in the background. He was, just like an add-on kind of person. And yet I knew for sure that he had been the powerhouse on the team. I knew that from all of the people I'd spoken with. He'd broken most of the trail in the deep snow in the lower part of the mountain. He'd fixed most of the lines on the upper part of the mountain. He hauled enormous loads, and he was an endless source of encouragement and positive energy. So it kind of bothered me. It's like, why isn't he getting the recognition that all the other guys are getting? So anyway, it got me thinking, and I started poking around in books, journals, magazines from previous climbs. And I, as usual, I got a little carried away, and I went all the way back to the 1900s, when expeditions were coming to the high mountains of Asia, primarily to climb the 8,000 meter peaks. So there are 14 of them. Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah, so this is a very basic map. But Shishapangma is in Tibet. There are 5 in Pakistan, and the rest are in Nepal. I mean, it's a very basic map. Anyway, these teams would come from foreign countries, and they would usually be sponsored by their alpine clubs. So the French Alpine Club, the German Alpine Club, or if they were coming from the UK, they'd be sponsored by the Royal Geographical Society. And the expeditions usually came to this place, Darjeeling, India, because that's where they would hire local help. They would hire men, predominantly men, to carry loads to the mountain, and later they hired men to work on the mountain. Well, these guys weren't from Darjeeling. They were, for the most part, they were from the Khumbu region of Nepal. They were Sherpas of Tibetan origin. Now, the reason the expeditions didn't go to Nepal to hire them is that Nepal's borders were closed at that point. So the Sherpas traveled to Darjeeling, and the foreign expeditions hired them there. And these guys, they did everything. They hauled loads to the mountain. They cooked. They set up camps. They broke trail. And some of them climbed very high on these mountains and did quite technical things. But if you look at the reports, and there are reports after each expedition, because the teams would have to report back to their sponsors, the Alpine clubs, whatever. The reports would list the Western climbers very carefully by name, how high they got, what they did, their accomplishments. But the local climbers weren't very often listed by name. And in fact, usually they were referred to as 7 Sherpas or 10 porters or a number of coolies even. Reading it now, it feels quite disrespectful. And these guys worked really hard on those trips, and they sometimes suffered terribly. There are lots of examples. In the 30s, there were a number of German expeditions that came to Nanga Parbat. They were trying to do the first ascent of Nanga Parbat. And the 1934 expedition was it was one of the most disastrous. There were 9 people who died on that trip, and 6 of them were Sherpas from Darjeeling. These 4 Sherpas did not die. They managed to survive this trip, but I think you can see from the photograph that they suffered terribly. From the left to the right, that's Dathundu, Pasang Kukuli, Kitar, and Pasang Picture. Well, you can see that they're shattered by the experience, and they're all suffering from frostbite, both in their hands and in their feet. Nevertheless, all 4 of these guys continued working in the mountains for as long as they could. And for some, it wasn't long because there were additional accidents. And the reason they kept going to the mountains, of course, was to earn money for their families. This is a photograph of Pasang Kukuli being helped down off of Nanga Parbat on that trip. And his career only lasted another 5 years, because in 1939, while working on a K2 expedition, K2, second highest mountain in the world and often considered the most difficult of the high mountains, he volunteered to go from base camp all the way up to Camp 7, which was at around 7,500 meters, to rescue an American climber, Dudley Wolfe, who was stranded at Camp 7. Well, he was accompanied by Pasang Kitar Sherpa and Finsu Sherpa. So the 3 of them, 3 Sherpas and Dudley Wolfe, all died at that Camp 7. Now, obviously, Dudley Wolfe was there because he wanted to be there. The 3 Sherpas were working on the mountain. Pasang Kukuli was only 28 years old when he disappeared on K2, and he left behind a young wife and 2 small children. Well, apart from the suffering and the sacrifices that they made, there's also the question of acknowledgement, just simple acknowledgement. The leader of that expedition was Fritz Wiesner, and some of you may know the history of this expedition. It's quite a famous one. And he was quite famous for his climbing skills, particularly on rock. On that expedition, he reached 8,383 meters. This is in 1939, climbing without bottled oxygen, which is pretty phenomenal, really. They were only 230 meters from the top of K2. Well, a lot of people celebrated that accomplishment that he did, but not many people celebrate his rope mate, Pasang Dawa Lama. Now, to be fair, Wiesner, the guy who was the leader of the expedition, was doing the leading on that climb, but Pasang Dawa Lama was there too, and he also didn't climb with bottled oxygen, and he was climbing with substandard equipment, and he didn't have that burning desire to get to the top. However, he did have a burning desire a few years later, because in 1954, Pasang Dawa Lama made the first ascent of Choyayu. And then 4 years later, he made the second ascent of Choyayu, also an 8,000 meter peak. So in those few years, he had sort of evolved from high altitude belayer to high altitude partner. And on the first ascent of Choyayu, he was actually leading. Now, it was an Austrian team, and if you read the reports, you wouldn't necessarily get that. But if you read between the lines, it's pretty clear that he was the motivating force, and he actually led the climbers to the top. Well, within the Darjeeling community, he was known as the top climbing Sherpa of the day. But he was and continues to be quite unknown outside of that community. Well, another example goes back to 1953, and this is again on K2. You can see I have a particular interest in K2. Dr. Charles Houston, I'm sure many of you know of him, or maybe some of you have even met him. A great American doctor and a climber. Anyway, he was leading an expedition to K2, but this time he wasn't hiring Sherpas from Darjeeling. And that was because of partition in 1947. India had broken into two, and now the Karakoram was in Pakistan. So it wasn't possible for Sherpas from India to come into Pakistan, so he was hiring local people from northern Pakistan. Well, as there was an accident high on the mountain. It was quite a famous accident when Art Gilkey disappeared. And after that, the rest of the team, slowly made their way back down to base camp, and they were in rough shape. Some frostbite, mostly exhaustion. George Bell was one of those American climbers, and he was in really bad shape, so bad that he had to be carried. And it was this man, Mohammed Hussein, from Sadpara village in Pakistan, who carried him for days. More than 20 years later, Mohammed Hussein was still carrying injured people off of K2. And almost 30 years later, he was hired by Steve Swenson, a well-known climber from the Seattle area, to be his sirdar for a Gasherbrum 4 expedition. Hardly anybody knows his name or knows anything about him. Mohammed Hussein. I know this is a terrible photo, but bear with me. It's historically important. Gyaltsen Norbu Sherpa made the first ascent of Makalu in 1955 and the first ascent of Manaslu in 1956, and this is him on Manaslu. So, 2 first ascents of 8,000 meter peaks. There are only 2 other climbers in the world with that record, Herman Buhl and Kurt Diemberger. And both of those guys are world famous mountaineering legends. Hardly anybody's heard of Gyaltsen Norbu Sherpa. Jump ahead to 1985, when French climber Jean-Marc Boivin flew off the summit of Gasherbrum 2 with a hang glider. Well, it was kind of a stunt, but still, he became quite famous for doing that. But few people know that this guy carried the hang glider up there. Little Karim is his name, and he is really little, was. He's smaller than me. Yeah, he carried that hang glider. It was 55 pounds to the top of the mountain so that Boisvan could fly off the top, and this is a typical example. Well, there are lots of other examples where throughout the history of climbing in the high mountains of Asia, where the people who worked hard for the success of the expedition didn't get much credit. And one of the saddest examples was, once again, on K2. It was an early expedition, and it was on the first ascent of the mountain in 1954. There was just one team on the mountain that summer, and it was an Italian expedition led by Ardito Desio. He had on his team 11 Italian climbers. He'd hired 13 Hunza porters to climb high on the mountain, and he had hundreds of Balti porters who were carrying stuff to base camp, 13 tons of stuff that they carried to base camp. Again, because it was after partition, all the workers on the mountain were from northern Pakistan. Well, the two summit climbers that he had chosen needed extra oxygen to be carried up to help them make the summit. And Desio appointed Walter Bonatti, who was the youngest person on the team, to carry the oxygen up to the two summit climbers. Well, Walter Bonatti couldn't carry it all, so he asked this guy, Amir Mehdi, to help him. Well, he actually kind of tricked him. Because Amir Mehdi didn't want to do it. So he made some sort of vague promises that there could be a chance to go for the summit and whatnot. And so off they went. They went up to the spot where the two summit climbers were supposed to be bivouacked just before their summit bid. It was around 8,100 meters. And they couldn't find them. They couldn't find them. They yelled and screamed and, everything they could to find these two summit climbers. And finally, just before dusk, they heard some voices coming down from above them. Leave the oxygen and descend. Well, it was too late to descend because it was starting to be dark. So they decided to bivouac for the night. And I'm just going to read a short passage from the book about what happened. Mehdi was frantic by that point, pacing, kicking at the slope, and howling in pain. His toes were crammed inside Italian army boots 2 sizes too small. They were beginning to freeze. Bonatti felt it was too risky to attempt a night descent, so he stomped out a platform on which to bivouac until morning. The night sky dazzled with a million stars so bright the two men could see their reflections in the snow. As the paralyzing cold encircled them, they shivered, clinging together, sharing their warmth on the highest open bivouac in history at that time. But the starlight faded when the first gusts of a blizzard moved in. Driving snow plastered the climbers' clothing and coated their faces. The desperate night dragged on. At times, neither Bonatti nor Mehdi were sure if they were alive or dead. Finally, shortly before dawn, Mehdi howled one last scream and stumbled off the platform, intent on reaching the tent more than 350 meters below. As Bonatti watched him reeling down the slope in the half-light, appearing confused and clumsy, out of control, he doubted that Mehdi would make it down alive. He was wrong. Mehdi, his feet numb with frostbite and his face contorted in pain, eventually lurched into the camp, where Isakan, another Hunza high-altitude porter, tended him. Bonatti arrived hours later. At 6 p.m. on that same day, July the 31st, 1954, Campagnoni and Lacedelli summited, making the first ascent of K2. But their victory had come at a terrible price. Mehdi was transported to a hospital in the city of Skardu and then to a military hospital in Rawalpindi, where doctors amputated all of his toes and a third of one foot. 8 months later, he returned to his home in Shimshal. He had lost the ability to climb and could no longer support his family. Well, the two Italians became celebrated heroes, particularly in Italy, for the first ascent of K2. And Bonatti, I'm sure some of you have heard of Walter Bonatti's name, became one of the most celebrated alpinists of all time. Mehdi spent the remaining 45 years of his life living in pain and obscurity. Well, nearly 60 years later, there was another important ascent of K2, the theme, Mountain for Tonight. And this was the first winter ascent. And I can't think of a better example of how things changed for local climbers since 1954. So, like Nanga Parbat, climbers have been trying to climb K2 in winter for over 34 years without success. And the prize just got bigger and bigger. So in the winter of 2020, 2021, there were 60 climbers vying for that first winter ascent. So 60 climbers at K2 base camp in the middle of winter. It was an unheard of situation. They came from around the world. Famous climbers, experienced climbers, some not so experienced, guided climbers, and lots of local workers, all huddled around K2 base camp in the cold. Well, among them were 10 Nepali climbers. 3 were from the Rolwaling Valley, led by this guy, Mingmaji. His sole reason for being there was to claim the first winter ascent of K2 for Nepal. And there were 5 professional Sherpa climbers there as well, who were supporting this guy, Nirmal Purja, known as Nimsdai or Nims, and they were also trying to claim the first ascent of K2 for Nepal. And there was one more Nepali climber, Sona Sherpa. So this was the team. Pretty powerful looking bunch. Well, the 10 Nepali climbers hadn't initially planned to work together. In fact, Mingmaji and Nims were in a little bit of competition. However, when Mingmaji was fixing ropes somewhere above 7,000 meters, he and his other 2 partners realized that they were running out of lines, running out of rope. So their problem turned into an opportunity. He got a hold of Nims. Nims had lots of rope, and they decided to start working together. And by the end of that year, 2020, they were one powerful team. So again, I'm going to read a little bit from the book about what happened to these guys from Camp 3 and above on K2. Camp 3 began stirring at midnight. After the usual ordeal of lighting the stoves, boiling water, double and triple checking the contents of their packs, and then stuffing their feet into their high-altitude boots, they emerged from the tents one by one. Nimsdai, Kili, Dawa Tenjin, Sona, Dawa Temba, and Mingma Tenzi left first. Mingmaji came to the sad realization that his previous day's efforts had so exhausted him that he didn't feel strong enough to climb without oxygen. Disappointed, he fiddled with his oxygen regulator, which didn't fit properly. He eventually found a spare regulator, but chilled his fingers dangerously in the process of attaching it. By the time he was finally ready to start up, the others were already nearing Camp 4. It didn't look like a promising summit day for Mingmaji. He left Camp 3 with Mingma David, Pemchiri, and Gelji. They reached Camp 4 2 hours later and were shocked at the chilling effects of the wind. When Mingma stopped for a few moments on the upper side of a crevasse while waiting for Mingma David, he became so cold, he considered turning around. He said, "I almost gave up there because I was worried to lose my toes." He checked his watch. It was 5 a.m. In another hour, the sun would appear above the horizon, so he decided to continue, at least until dawn. At the same moment that he felt the first warming rays of the sun, the wind miraculously dropped, as it does. The 4 climbers stopped to soak up the rays and warm themselves before climbing up to the bottleneck. The heat from the sun had given them extra energy and hope. The first group was fixing lines up the bottleneck, Mingma Tenzing leading the way. Mingma G's group climbed towards them and finally caught up before the traverse. Nimsdai urged them on. "We all had that common pride, a common goal. This was for Nepal," he said. When they reached the small plateau 200 meters below the summit, they stopped to brew some tea. After resting a bit, Mingma Tenzing resumed fixing. They were still 4 hours from the summit. They planned to stop around 10 meters from the top and continue as a group to the highest point. "We all started moving together, and our 360 GoPro was on," Mingma said. "We then started moving towards the summit, singing the national anthem. This was my 3rd time summiting on K2. But this time, it was connected with the pride of the nation. It was a thrilling moment. I had tears in my eyes and my body was shaking itself, bearing goosebumps. No member in the team can explain the moment we had there." The 10 Nepali climbers stepped onto the summit at 4:43 p.m., January 16th, 2021, first winter ascent of K2. The video of their final steps to the summit sped around the world, delighting millions. What a sight. Their faces lit up by the low-angled sun, the distinct curvature of the earth as their backdrop, their crimson and gold suits as bright as jewels, and that magnificent indigo sky. I know. Well, they were happy. They descended to base camp, and then they flew to Skardu and then Kathmandu, and it was just an endless series of celebrations. I mean, the whole world was aware of this climb, I think, and it was happy for them.
And this is during COVID.
Yes, it was during COVID. And in fact, one of the reasons they did it is that Nepal was closed that season. And so they had all been out of work for a season. And it was almost like an opportunity for them because Pakistan hadn't closed their doors. So it was just one of those weird things. Well, in the years, almost 60 years that separated those two expeditions, there were a lot of small steps along the way that made this sort of a different reality for local climbers from Nepal and Pakistan. And the first thing is that their climbing skills had improved a lot in that period of time. And along with those improvements in their skills came changing expectations. They were no longer content to just break trail and fix lines and do all that stuff if there was no chance to go to the summit. For example, this is Pertemba Sherpa and Sir Chris Bonington, a British climber. When Pertemba agreed to climb with Chris in 1975 on his attempt at the southwest face of Everest, Pertemba said he would work for him, but only if he had a chance at the summit. And Chris agreed, and he did get his summit. Another change had to do with communication skills. As long as local climbers from Pakistan and Nepal were uneducated, and in some cases illiterate, it was difficult for them to communicate their needs to their employers, and it was also impossible for them to find sponsorship for their own personal aspirations, climbing aspirations. This guy, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, Babu Shiri Sherpa. He was a great communicator. He could speak 4 languages. He was educated, and he was just an instantly likable guy. He also understood the power of the media, and so much so that he realized that he could find sponsors if he could just generate enough attention about his career. So one of his sponsors was Mountain Hardware, who provided him, they built him a special super lightweight tent so that he could spend the night on the summit of Everest. I know, it's kind of silly, but he did it, and he also had some speed records and so on. He was actually a very successful climber, and he was considered a national hero in Nepal. Unfortunately, he died in a crevasse while working on an expedition at the age of 35. But a much bigger communication change happened when local climbers started using social media. So again, you can imagine what that was like. Now they could tell their own stories. They didn't have to wait, or they didn't have to raise money to make a film. They didn't have to wait for some magazine editor to notice them, or book publisher. They could just go on the internet and tell their own stories. Imtiaz Sadpara is from Sadpara village, and he's not a famous climber. He's a very active climber, but even Imtiaz has 3,000 followers. Nims, anybody want to take a guess? 547,000. And there are countless others. And one of the things that I've enjoyed the most in the process of writing this book is starting to follow these guys on social media, because it's fascinating how different everyone is, but they're all out there telling their stories, and it's just really fun to follow them. In some cases, they're elevating their profile. In other cases, they're monetizing their profile, as you can imagine. And some of them are just, staying connected to the overall mountain community. Well, another big step is when local climbers started to take over the business of guiding on their mountains. And this too is happening, particularly in Nepal, where some of the companies are big and powerful. Now this image, you would probably guess would be on, it's on Annapurna. Yeah, it's not just Everest anymore. This was taken in 2021 when 68 climbers summited just 2 weeks after arriving at base camp. Yeah, things have changed. All of these incremental changes added up to that incredible moment on the summit of K2 when 10 Nepali climbers could claim a first winter ascent of an 8,000 meter peak. However, high altitude climbing remains one of the most dangerous activities in the mountains, particularly if you're working up there day after day. And that K2 winter season was not yet over. Among the people still at base camp was Ali Sadpara, the guy that you saw at the beginning, and his son, Sajid, and they had a client from Iceland, John Snorri. In early February, there was another potential weather window, so the 3 of them and a bunch of independent climbers all headed up. Well, they made it as far as Camp 3. Sorry. And Camp 3 was not a good place to be. There were too many climbers and not enough tents. So people were crowding into tents, 6 into a tent designed for 3. They didn't have enough room to melt snow, to make tea, to cook, to rest. It was just a nightmare. Plus, the temperatures were terrifyingly cold. Well, a number of independent climbers actually went down that night. And this was February 4th. But Sajid and his father Ali and John Snorri stayed. And this is what Ali Sadpara looked like that night in the tent. You get a sense of how pleasant it was. And the next day, well, actually during the night, The three of them headed up along with an independent climber, a Chilean climber, J.P. Moore. So they started running into troubles, well, Sajid did in particular, at the bottleneck. He was having problems breathing, basically. He tried to use a bottle of oxygen and it didn't fit. And so his father said, look, you need to go down. Go back down to Camp 3. The three of us will carry on and you wait for us there. So he did. He went down to Camp 3 and he got back to the tent at around 5 p.m. He melted some snow, made tea, left a light on so that the summit climbers would more easily find the tent. And yeah, he just waited, and he waited all night, kept making tea. They never came down. Eventually, and he was in contact with base camp, and they said, look, you need to get off this mountain because there's a storm coming, and you need to get down while you still can. Well, so he did eventually. He descended K2 by himself, got to base camp. Meanwhile, his father and two other people are on the mountain. A couple of days later, helicopters came in, did some circles around the mountain looking for any sign of them, nothing at all. Then two of Ali Sadpara's nephews from Sadpara village, who were working on the mountain but in base camp at that time, started heading up. Maybe they could find some trace of them. But by this time, the storm had really moved in, so they were shut down as well. So Sajid flew to Skardu, where, of course, the media was, just going crazy. What's going on? This is a really big story. So he went to a press conference and explained that he was quite sure that there was no chance that anyone was still alive. And then he left the press conference and went home to his family. And later that year, first of all, I'll show you a happier photo of father and son. This was obviously taken years before. Later that year, Sajid returned to K2 to search for the bodies. And these are his words. He said, I had one of the most challenging and traumatic experiences in life. I don't want to remember the time of despair and fear. I am healing myself, and I try to heal the whole family as well. I am recovering my strength and my rationality with the passage of time. And I decided to lead the search and recovery of my father, Ali Sadpara, John Snorri, and J.P. Moore. My family and I will leave no stone unturned to recover them and give the right rituals as per everyone's faith. I don't know what happened to them. That is why I am here now. It's been 4.5 months. Of course, I know he is not alive. I was grateful to those who used technology I wouldn't begin to understand to look for them from afar. And now it's my turn to go back and see for myself. My father is with Allah now. He is safe. I go only to find answers and to retrace those last steps, to see what he might have seen, to see if he left any signs for me to follow, if there's anything he wants me to know. Well, it's a sad ending to what started out as such a triumphant season for local climbers, but it's also a realistic ending because although foreign climbers traditionally go to the high mountains of Asia for personal reasons, local climbers, for the most part, go to the high mountains of Asia to earn money. It's the fastest way, but unfortunately the most dangerous way for them to earn enough money to support their families and educate their kids, which is their motivation. Well, these climbers, whether they're famous or unknown, whether they're well-trained or they're still learning on the job, whether they're record holders or they're just, starting out, these are the climbers who are writing the next chapter of climbing in the Himalaya and the Karakoram. And for some of them, it's already brought them fame and fortune with a few. And for others, they're getting and have been trained to the highest level of climbing competence, mountaineering competence, the UIAGM guides certification. So they're qualified to guide anywhere in the world. But many, many more are still working in the high mountains with second-rate equipment, usually used, no training, marginal salaries, and no insurance for injury or for death. And that is a huge problem in Pakistan. So this is Ming Maji again. So he is a UIAGM guide, and he owns one of Nepal's most successful guiding companies. And he's one of the most respected climbers in the country. He's guardedly optimistic about the future of Nepali climbers. In his words, "I think we should do what we can to make our own community proud, to test human limits and to make oneself better and better. Sherpas and mountains are synonymous to each other. Our future generation will be far better than us. I'm not ready to quit alpinism until I feel that I've helped change mountaineering in Nepal." Dawa Yangzum Sherpa, who actually joined me a couple of days ago in Seattle at this event in Seattle, which was really a thrill because I'd never met her in person before. Well, she's actually helping change mountaineering in Nepal because she's training young women, both climbing and mountaineering and expeditioning kinds of skills, but also leadership skills. This fellow, Vinayak Mala, another UIAGM guide from Nepal, is doing something a little bit different. I mean, he works in the high mountains in order to earn a living, but his real passion is rock climbing and ice climbing. So he's developing crags, rock climbing crags and ice climbing areas for people who want to come to Nepal and climb, but not necessarily at 8,000 meters, which I think is a really smart thing that he's doing. Sirbaz Khan is the young guy on the left. He's probably Pakistan's leading high altitude climber at the moment. And this photo shows him with his mentor and teacher, Ali Raza Sadpara. Well, Sirbaz takes his position within the climbing community in Pakistan seriously. He says, because he's in a position of leadership, he says, "I am fully committed to winning honor and pride for my country, for my people, and especially the underprivileged mountaineering community of Pakistan. The coming period is ours. We will try our best to leave a better field for the coming generation. I will work for them, whether it's insurance, training, or any other way. Our climbing community can go a long way if we work together." And Sajid, son of Ali, and also a rising star in Asia, he's both hopeful and optimistic. He says, "We are the new generation, and we are ready for new challenges and our rightful place in climbing history." Well, this book is about climbers from Pakistan and Nepal, climbers with names few people have heard, climbers from remote villages, climbers who were trusted partners, climbers whose skills improved and their expectations rose. Ultimately, it's about climbers who are transforming mountaineering in the Himalaya and the Karakoram through their ability to guide and teach, to create successful businesses, and for a few, to realize their personal dreams. 3 sisters on the top of Everest. But for still too many, they're still making the ultimate sacrifice for their clients. Like this young man, Tenjin Lama Sherpa, who died last year while guiding on Shishapangma. Well, this book is about respect for all of these men and women who work in the highest mountains on earth and who are emerging from out of the shadows and into the light. Thank you. Thank Thank you. So getting back to that question, any thoughts from any of you? Why do you think all these years we still tend to look at, or still tend to know the names of the employers as opposed to the employees?
Employers write the stories.
Exactly. Employers write the stories, which is why social media is kind of important, I think. Yeah.
So, if guiding 8,000 meter peaks was a profession in the States, which I suppose it is in some ways, but it feels like it maybe wouldn't be allowed as a profession because it's so dangerous. Like, is there, I understand this is a way out of poverty for a lot of the Sherpas, but is there sort of an ethical, is there any thought to the morality of hiring somebody to do such a dangerous job within the climbing community? Like, should it only be, those who want to risk it for their own personal motivation as opposed to for $1? And or is that just a good question?
No, it's an interesting question, but I don't think that will ever happen. I don't think there will ever be a discussion that comes to some kind of conclusion that says guiding 8,000 meter peaks is too dangerous, therefore if we want to climb them we have to do them on our own. There are hundreds and thousands of people who are rushing to Asia to climb 8,000 meter peaks who there's no way on earth they could do them without being guided. It's a huge business and the governments know that.
Are they not licensed, and isn't there a licensure and some kind of controlling factor of who can guide, or is it still a free-for-all?
I wouldn't call it. Oh, sure. Yeah. Is there some kind of a certification or a kind of a formal process?
A licensure.
A licensing.
A lot of Asia tour guides have not necessarily climbing peaks, but it's all licensed a lot. So I'm just wondering if that's.
Yeah. Well, definitely. There is absolutely licensing. There are companies that hire people, high altitude workers, to guide these mountains. One of the problems is that the companies are not all created equal. So the training of the actual guides or the workers is not always equal. So some of the people who are guiding are perfectly qualified, perfectly trained, not just to get people up, but also to get them back down again in case of, an accident or something like that. But that's not always the case. It really isn't always the case.
This is slightly off topic, but I've read a lot of books about climbing, and I understood that the Sherpas and other people from the region found it almost anti-spiritual to climb some of these mountains. And is that changed now? Is that no longer appealing?
So this is about spirituality and whether Sherpas in particular or local climbers in general, yeah, have a different feeling towards those high mountains. From what I understand, also from books that I've read and also from speaking with local climbers, yeah, they do have a spiritual relationship with the mountains, but they're also practical people, and many of them are entrepreneurial, and business is business. And so, there are still some peaks that are kind of, the actual summits are off limits, but I think for the most part, there are ceremonies that are done, and And there are certain things that, just shouldn't happen from a local climber's perspective on a mountain. But I think they've figured out a way to manage that spirituality and also the business.
What's the origin of the word Sherpa? And I noticed you were sort of using it almost like Smith or something. Is it essentially like a last name?
Well, yeah, it's an ethnic group, and so the names, it's very confusing because also you heard quite a few Mi'kmaq and so on. So Sherpa is the name of an ethnic group, and so I mentioned one fellow who didn't have Sherpa as his last name because he's not Sherpa. He's Nepali, and this book talks about Nepali climbers. Nims, for example, isn't a Sherpa. The most famous Nepali climber at the moment is not Sherpa. He's Gurkha. And the other confusing thing is that with the Pakistani climbers from northern Pakistan, they tend to take the name of their village as their name. So Ali Raza Sadpara, Sajid Sadpara, Taki Hushe. Hushe is the name of a village. So it's confusing, but it's interesting.
So it doesn't translate to guy or something?
No. It's an ethnic word. That it? No.
So who's exploiting these that are helping the Sherpas? Is it more the government or is it the climbers themselves? Someone's making the money, right?
Yep.
And hasn't been the Sherpas historically.
Yeah. Historically, they haven't been making the money. I wouldn't say that's completely true now. It depends. If you own a business, and a number of Sherpas in particular do now own guiding businesses, then it's a different thing altogether because you have the business, then you hire people, and you charge a lot of money, right, for these climbs. But you're not just working for wages and tips. You actually are taking in the big money from the clients. So those guys are doing really well. In fact, I think most people understand that the people who live in the Khumbu region of Nepal are actually the richest people of all Nepal, and it's because of climbing, basically. In Pakistan, there are also companies that have hire guides, but it's less well organized, and as a result, most of the guiding that's taking place in Pakistan is done by Nepalis. So they're very frustrated by that because, it's pretty clear that money is being made. It's just that they're not making it. That's very frustrating.
I just want to say thank you very much for the book, for the talk, but thank you for bringing that topic to light.
No.
Very wonderful. Thank you.
No, it was an honor, actually.